Hi everybody, welcome back to Egyptian History with Dr. Young. That'll be me, as you probably all know. Today I want to just quickly go through some of the periods of Egyptian history so you get an idea of the time periods that we're talking about and where the New Kingdom fits in with the rest of the framework of Egyptian history. And then I want to go through some of the basic sources of Egyptian history so we can see how we know what we know about ancient Egypt. Basically, when you're dividing up the history of ancient Egypt, you've got three main periods and then a few other extras to go there, but the main ones are the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. So they're the three major periods of Egyptian history. The Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom periods were times where Egypt was strong and powerful and was one united kingdom. There are a few different periods that go in there as well, but these are the main three. So the Old Kingdom goes from around 3000 to 2345 BC. Middle Kingdom, I'm just got a cheat sheet here, but that's okay. 2055 to 1700 BC, and the New Kingdom, which is the period we're studying, goes from about 1550 to around about 1070 BC. Now, these dates aren't exact. We don't know exactly the precise year when certain events took place, but these are kind of ballpark figures. As you can see, there are gaps in between all of these, and there are actually intermediate periods, what we call first intermediate, and second intermediate. These are periods in between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, and the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, where Egypt basically descended into chaos, where rather than having one central state that was very powerful, Egypt broke up into smaller kingdoms and smaller realms. In the latter part of the second intermediate period, it was actually invaded by a foreign power. The Egyptians called them the Hyksos. We don't really know who they were or where they came from, but the Egyptians certainly regarded them as foreigners and deeply resented being ruled over by them. First intermediate was just sort of like a general period of chaos before the re-establishment of the Middle Kingdom. So basically you've got three periods of strength and power, the Old, Middle and New Kingdom, and two periods of chaos in between them, the first intermediate and the second intermediate. Now this doesn't mean that you just had civil war and who knows what going all over the countryside. Sometimes it meant that just there was a change of ruler, or rather than having one strong, powerful state, you had lots and lots of smaller ones, not necessarily at war, although often that was the case. We have to remember when we're thinking about our historical sources that they were all written by aristocratic men. And so we basically have their perspective. We don't have the perspective of the poorer people, the common people, if you like, in Egypt. We don't have very many female perspectives at all. So we have to remember that what we know and understand about ancient Egypt is very much the product of our sources. So while, for example, an aristocratic Egyptian would think of the second intermediate when they were ruled over by foreigners as a terrible thing because they regarded Egyptians as better than everyone else, and obviously the ruling class of Egypt wanted to be running things and they resented the fact that Egypt was being run by someone else. So the second intermediate period might have looked a little bit different depending on who you were. But generally speaking, the kingdoms are periods of unity and strength. The intermediate periods are periods of certainly less strength and certainly less unity. We also have the pre-dynastic period. This is the very early period before 3000, where Egypt was just first being put together as a state. So very, very early, only just the beginning of written records. We have a few hieroglyphic inscriptions from that time and some later legendary stuff that tells us about what happened or what allegedly happened during that time, but we really don't know a great deal about it. The Old Kingdom, after Egypt was solidly established as a powerful kingdom, that's the period where the pyramids were built. So the pyramids are actually built by some of the very oldest, earliest kings of Egypt, and they're pretty much the oldest surviving monuments in Egypt, or the oldest significant ones. They go along pretty well to about 2345 BC, as I say. Then we break down into the first intermediate period. Then unity is re-established in the Middle Kingdom. These kings actually rule from Thebes in southern Egypt. We looked a little bit about Thebes in our last lesson. Then we have the second intermediate period. So Middle Kingdom breaks down into a period of conflict and chaos. Then it's taken over by the Hyksos. And then we go into the New Kingdom period of Egyptian history. So the New Kingdom is actually the period that we'll be studying. This is the time where Egypt was at its most powerful, where it reached out into other territories. It took over territories in Syria and Palestine, in Libya and in Nubia to the south. So it expanded, it became very, very wealthy and very, very powerful. So that's the period that we're looking at, and that comes to an end in about 1070. So you then have the third intermediate, then what's called the late period, and then you go on down into the Ptolemaic and the Roman periods. And we won't go that far. The Ptolemaic period ends in 31 BC, and that's where Cleopatra is. She's the Egyptian that people most know about. Oddly enough, she wasn't actually an Egyptian, she was a Macedonian. She was a descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals, but she was the last independent ruler of Egypt, pretty much until modern times. But what we're concentrating on, as I said, is the New Kingdom. Now, the families of the rulers of Egypt are all divided up into dynasties. So a dynasty would be a succession of kings from the same family. So the Old Kingdom, for example, is dynasty 1 through to 6. Usually use Roman numerals. I hope that's actually on the camera. Should be right. The Middle Kingdom is 11 to 13. And the New Kingdom is 18 to 20. And so the other dynasties, so like the 7th through to the 10th, are in the first intermediate period, the 14th through to the 17th in the second intermediate period. So when we're referring to dynasties, as I say, that means just a family or a succession of kings. If you look on the back of your course guide, there is a list of the kings of the 18th, 19th and 20th dynasties. So the 18th dynasty kings, they're the start of the New Kingdom. They rule right down to Tutankhamun. He's the last king of the 18th dynasty, really. Then you start the Seti and Ramesses, and they're the kings of the 19th dynasty, and then you finish up with the 20th dynasty. So those are the three dynasties that we'll be studying as the New Kingdom Egypt. So that's just an outline of Egyptian history, giving you an idea of where we're going with this. So New Kingdom from 1550 to 1070 BC, that is 1550 years before the birth of Christ. So we're looking at about 3,500 years ago that our period starts, and around about 3,000 years ago it finishes. Okay, so now we're looking at some of the sources for Egyptian history. So how do we know what we know about ancient Egypt? How do archaeologists, historians actually decipher and understand all the things that took place in ancient Egypt? There's lots and lots of different sources that we can look at. So I just want to briefly go through some of them so you've got some idea. First ones we want to look at are papyri and ostraca. Papyrus is basically it's an early form of paper, and this was made out of reeds that grow by the bank of the River Nile. Papyrus reed, these are flattened out, they're wetted and flattened out and ground with stones and sort of layered on top of one another and then dried out, and that forms a type of paper, basically an early type of paper that could be painted on or written on with ink, usually with ink and a brush. can see here, this is an example here. This is actually Greek writing here, so this is a fairly late papyrus. But as we noted in the earlier lesson about the climate of Egypt, it's really, really dry there. There's virtually no rainfall, particularly in the desert areas. And so something perishable like that anywhere else would just rot away, in ancient Egypt, or in Egypt, it's actually survived for thousands of years. And so as you can see, it's a little bit worse for wear. There are little bits missing here and there, but generally speaking, this is decipherable. And so we've got papyri that go back a very, very long time. So they can provide us with lots and lots of information about ancient Egypt. They tell us about the religion and the gods of ancient Egypt, some lists of kings. There's a king list papyrus from Turin, or it's in Turin now. Personal letters, all sorts of things like that are provided on papyri. So that gives us a lot of information about ancient Egypt there. Also ostraca. An ostracon is just a broken piece of pottery. It's a Greek word. Ostraca is the plural. So here we have an ostracon from Deir el-Medina, which is the village where workmen lived who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And we'll be looking at that particular location next week. As you can see there, it's written on in Egyptian hieroglyphic script, and there are actually hundreds of these ostraca that were recovered from Deir el-Medina and other places like that. But particularly Deir el-Medina. There are letters from officials, from one official to another. There are personal letters, there are laundry lists, there are bills of sale, there are all kinds of things that gives us a very strong insight into what life was like at Deir el-Medina. And not just Deir el-Medina, all over Egypt, these kind of ostraca give us, yet again, more insight into the day-to-day lives of some fairly everyday Egyptians. We don't get much from the very, very poorest people. These are sort of like produced by what we might call middle class, I suppose, so they're still quite well off. But they do give us some idea of Egyptian history that isn't just the really, really rich and the really, really powerful people. Now, because Egypt's so dry, as I say, these have been able to be preserved, but that does mean we have a little bit of an imbalance of evidence. So most of our evidence comes from places that are dry, that don't have any rainfall. For example, there were hundreds, thousands of villages throughout ancient Egypt, but we know the most about Deir el-Medina. Unlike nearly all other villages in ancient Egypt, Deir el-Medina was located outside of the cultivated zone, of that fertile green zone that we looked at in the last video, and in the desert area. The reason it was there was to keep it secret. It was a secret location. They didn't want everyone knowing where the people that dug the tombs and buried the pharaohs lived. So Deir el-Medina was secret. It was off in the mountains, in the hills, in the desert. But because of that, its climate's dry, and so much more of this stuff has survived. So we know heaps and heaps of stuff about ancient Egypt from the tombs, rather than the buildings of the living. And we might think that the Egyptians just obsessed about death, building tombs all over the place, and not building houses. Well, they built houses, but they built them in that cultivated zone, and because it's wet, and because there's moisture there, because there's continuous cultivation, because the buildings were mostly built out of wood and reeds, they've all been lost. But the stuff that was built in the desert, out of stone, that's survived much better. That tends to be funerary architecture, like tombs and temples, as opposed to the houses of the living. So it gives us a bit of an imbalance in our evidence. So you do have to bear that in mind. We also get a lot of evidence from tomb and monumental inscriptions. The Egyptians loved to inscribe down their feats and the great achievements of their lives. Often they would put this in the tomb. So this is an example from a tomb. You can see very brightly coloured wall paintings inside the tomb. These are fairly common, not just in royal tombs, but in the tombs of various nobles and officials. And they all recorded their own careers, what they had achieved in their life. So one particular famous tomb from the early 18th dynasty is the tomb of Ahmose, son of Ibana. He was a military commander under the command of several of the early pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, and he records all of the achievements of his life, what he did, the various battles that he fought in, and they help us to reconstruct a lot of those military campaigns in the early 18th dynasty. So not just the kings, but also the nobles and various other officials like to record all sorts of information about what they did. The kings, of course, absolutely loved to put down their great achievements, and we find them not only in their tombs, but also in particular in the great temples and monuments that they built. This is a relief inscription on a temple of Seti I from the 19th dynasty, and it shows the king here in his war chariot there, riding down and smiting all of his enemies. Pharaohs did a lot of smiting. And then around it we have the hieroglyphic inscription that records the achievements and the battles that Seti won. Now we can't necessarily take all of these at face value, because if the Egyptians got defeated, for example, they didn't like talking about that, so they didn't mention it. So we just have these great lists of victories that they're winning all the time. So you have to remember this is propaganda stuff, but generally speaking it reflects the truth, at least to some extent. This might be some campaigns that they just basically made up, but most of them seem to have some basis in historical fact. So Seti almost certainly did conduct several campaigns against the Libyans out toward the west of Egypt. Whether or not it was quite as uniformly victorious as this inscription says, then possibly not. But nonetheless, we can still learn a lot about the military activities in Seti's reign. As well as these relief inscriptions, we also have communications with other great powers, most notably the Amarna letters, which were from the 18th dynasty Pharaoh Akhenaten in the latter part of the 18th dynasty, and he wrote these letters to various other kings. Some of them were sort of like subsidiary kings that he dominated in Syria and in Palestine, but others were kings of other ancient superpowers such as Babylonia or Assyria. This is actually a letter to the king of Assyria, or from the king of Assyria rather. And letters went backwards and forwards between these kings, and at Tel El Amarna in Middle Egypt, this whole archive of these diplomatic letters have been uncovered, and they give us a very great insight into what was going on in the 18th dynasty, not only in Egypt, but also the way Egypt was communicating with and comparing itself in power and sort of jockeying for power with these other powers around about like Babylonia and Assyria. So these diplomatic archives like this are very, very important. It's actually written in cuneiform, which is the language from Mesopotamia, from modern-day Iraq. So they're not actually written in Egyptian hieroglyphics at all, because nobody outside Egypt could read them. This is sort of like the diplomatic language of the day that most ancient powers knew at least something about, and so it was what was used for communication back in those days. Another very important inscription is the Abydos king list. So this is just another example of an inscription, but this one is particularly valuable. This is Seti I again, the same guy that was in the military inscription earlier. And here we have King Seti I and his son, who's named Ramesses. So he was the future King Ramesses II, but he's still just the crown prince at this particular time. But they're accompanied by the names of nearly all, of the earlier kings of Egypt. So we see these little oval things here. They're called cartouches, and when you see that in a hieroglyphic inscription, it means it's recording the name of a king. So the king had several names. He'd have his birth name, his Osiris name, his throne name, and so each one of these just represents one king and the different names and titles that he had. But it's a list of the kings of Egypt, and so that's really, really useful for a historian, because it actually gives us a reign by reign list of the kings of Egypt. Now, it's not a complete list. They only wanted to recognise when Egypt was powerful and united. So they miss out all of the kings of the first and second intermediate periods. They just don't count them. They only record the kings of the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom up to the 19th dynasty, up till Seti I. However, there's even a few missing out of the New Kingdom as well. Some of the kings and one queen out of the 18th dynasty, Hatshepsut, who was a queen who usurped her husband, or her son-in-law and husband, and nephew, all the same person. We'll talk more about that later. But she usurped him and reigned herself as Pharaoh. So she wasn't recognised by later pharaohs as a legitimate ruler. So her name's not on this list. We have Akhenaten, the guy that was the author of those, the diplomatic archive that we were just looking at. He was what was termed a religious heretic. He tried to change the religion of Egypt to the worship of one god, the Aten, and that was rejected after his death. And so he's not on the list either. They didn't want to think back to that time because they saw that as a time of blasphemy against the gods, for example. This is in a temple, and they didn't want to have his name in the temple of one of the gods that he rejected. His son, probably his son, Tutankhamun, the most famous Egyptian pharaoh, not because of anything he did, but simply due to the fact that his tomb was preserved, is also not on the list because he was considered to have been tainted by the memory of Akhenaten. So, even though it's not a complete list, still really useful, giving this very comprehensive list of the rulers of ancient Egypt right up until Seti I. As well as the Egyptian sources themselves, we've got Greek and Roman literary sources. This is a bust of Herodotus, who was a famous Greek historian. So he wrote all about the Greek and Persian wars. Some of you might remember studying that last year. But he records a lot of stuff that he got from Egypt, things that have now been lost. Plutarch and others also recorded more information from Egypt than we have available now. So the stuff that they recorded, sometimes it's garbled, sometimes it's just played wrong, sometimes people will clearly just tell them the story, but a lot of the times the stuff they record is useful and we wouldn't otherwise have it. So we get some of our Egyptian history from these Greek and Roman literary sources. And finally we have the archaeological material, right from the huge buildings and temples, which tell us a lot about the people that built them, and of course they also have inscriptions recording the great achievements. So this is the temple of Hatshepsut. That was the queen that I was referring to earlier, who was ruling as king over Egypt. So you might think it's funny that a woman was referred to as king, but she was actually legally made herself king so that she could rule over Egypt. But she built that temple, and a lot of her achievements are recorded in inscriptions and paintings on the walls of that temple. Over here, on the other hand, we have, by contrast, scarabs, little things that are about that big or even smaller. These were sort of amulets, charms. Sometimes they were used as seals for sealing wax to seal letters, but they would have the image of a beetle on one side, a scarab beetle or a dung beetle, that the Egyptians considered sacred because they believed they were actually born from the dung, so that they sort of like just came to life. They didn't know exactly how that worked. But they usually have the name of an Egyptian ruler inscribed on the back of them. So this is the top side, you see the beetle there, and that's the other side of it, which has a hieroglyphic inscription. If you find those at a historic site or an archaeological site, then that tells you that this couldn't have been laid down any earlier than that, because if that's a scarab of Seti I, for example, got no idea if it is, then that means it could not have been built any earlier or laid down any earlier than that particular date. So they help with the dating of various archaeological sites and archaeological information. So that's just a summary of some of the historical sources that we can use to learn about ancient Egypt. As we go through the historic parts of the course, I'll be giving you samples of those primary sources, or some of those primary sources, and you can use those. I expect you and encourage you to use those in your essays. And they'll also, of course, be on the Google Classroom. This, as well as this video, this actual PowerPoint is also on the Google Classroom, so you can have a look back over that, or if they didn't show up well enough in the video, you can examine those yourself, and of course you can make use of those images in that as well. So that's all for this week. I just want you to have a look through these videos, have a look through the printed material that will be on the Google Classroom, the notes from these lessons, And also look through that course booklet, start to think about what essay topics you might be interested in. If you get time, start to have a look, a bit of a research to find out some more about those things. Next week, we'll start looking at the Valley of the Kings and the Theban necropolis, that area near the city of Thebes where the pharaohs of the 18th, 19th and 20th dynasties were buried. We'll look at those, some of the amazing things that were discovered there, and some of the amazing things that we can learn about ancient Egypt from there.